Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling completely turned around, agreeing to something you never actually wanted, apologizing for something that wasn't your fault, doubting a memory you were certain of 5 minutes earlier, and only later, alone, did the fog clear enough to ask, "Wait, what just happened to me?" If you have, you've met manipulation from the inside, and here is the question worth sitting with. Why do some people walk out of that same room, completely unmoved? Not cold, not suspicious of everyone, just solid, unshakable, in a way that seems to run deeper than confidence, deeper than intelligence, deeper than simply not falling for it. The truth is that resistance to manipulation isn't a personality trait you're born with or without. It's a specific, learnable architecture of mind, a way of relating to your own thoughts, your own worth, and your own reality that makes a person genuinely difficult to bend, no matter how skilled the person trying to bend them happens to be. This is not a story about becoming suspicious or guarded or cold toward the world. It's a story about becoming so rooted in yourself that manipulation simply has nowhere left to grip. Before we begin, if this is already resonating, do one small thing. Hit subscribe, not for me, for the steadier, harder to shake version of you this journey is about to help you build. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Why manipulation needs something from you first. There is a truth about manipulation that almost no one explains clearly, and understanding it changes everything about how you protect yourself from it. Manipulation cannot work on its own. It requires something from the target in order to succeed, a specific internal vulnerability it can hook into and pull. Without that hook, even the most skilled manipulator, using their most practiced techniques, simply has nothing to grab onto. Their words land and slide off, and nothing happens. This is worth sitting with directly, because it reframes the entire question this journey is going to explore. The common way of thinking about manipulation focuses almost entirely on the manipulator, their tactics, their tricks, their patterns of guilt-tripping or gaslighting or love-bombing, and understanding those tactics has real value. But it's incomplete because it treats manipulation as something that simply happens to a passive target, the way weather happens to a person standing outside. In reality, manipulation is closer to a lock-and-key mechanism. The manipulator brings the key, but without a matching lock already present in the target, an unresolved insecurity, an unclear sense of their own boundaries, a fear of disapproval, a habit of doubting their own perception, the key simply doesn't turn. People who cannot be manipulated are not people who've never encountered a skilled manipulator. They are people who have done the deeper, less visible work of removing or reinforcing the specific locks manipulation typically depends on. This is the actual foundation this entire journey is going to build on, and it's considerably more empowering than simply learning to spot tactics, because it puts the actual solution back in your own hands, rather than leaving you dependent on correctly identifying every manipulator you might ever encounter. Let me tell you about a woman named Perrine. Perrine spent years in a friendship with someone who reliably, skillfully, turned every disagreement into a referendum on whether Perrine was a good enough friend. Anytime Perrine expressed a need, a boundary, or even a mild preference that conflicted with her friend's wishes, the conversation would somehow, smoothly, redirect toward Perrine's supposed selfishness, her ingratitude, the various ways she'd fallen short as a friend in the past. Perrine, each time, would find herself apologizing, backing down, abandoning whatever she'd originally wanted. Not because she'd been persuaded by any actual argument, but because the accusation of being a bad friend triggered something in her so uncomfortable that she'd do almost anything to make it stop. For years, Perrine understood this pattern, when she thought about it at all, as simply a difficult friendship with a difficult person. It took a period of real reflection, prompted by a different friend gently pointing out the pattern from the outside, for Perrine to ask a harder, more useful question. Not simply, why does she keep doing this to me, but why does this particular tactic work on me so reliably, when I can see, intellectually, exactly what's happening while it's happening? The answer, once Perrine let herself examine it honestly, traced back to a specific, long-standing vulnerability, a deep, largely unexamined fear of being seen as selfish, rooted in a childhood where her own needs had reliably been framed by an overwhelmed parent as an unreasonable burden. This fear had never actually been resolved. It had simply been sitting there, unaddressed, for decades, a lock, fully formed and waiting, that her friend's specific accusation happened to fit perfectly. This is the mechanism worth understanding clearly, because it applies far beyond Perrine's specific situation. Manipulators, whether consciously strategic or simply operating on well-practiced instinct, tend to probe for exactly this kind of unresolved vulnerability, and they tend to become remarkably effective once they find it, because the vulnerability does most of the actual work. Perrine's friend didn't need particularly sophisticated tactics. She simply needed to locate the one accusation, "You're being selfish," that Perrine's own unresolved history had already made unbearable to sit with, and repeat it, in various forms, whenever she wanted Perrine to back down. I want to name something important about what this means for actually becoming resistant to manipulation, because it's considerably more hopeful than it might initially sound. If manipulation depends on a matching internal vulnerability, then the most durable, most complete protection available isn't primarily about becoming more suspicious of other people or more skilled at detecting tactics in real time, though those skills have some value too, and this journey will address them later. The deepest, most reliable protection comes from doing the work of identifying and addressing your own specific locks, so that even a manipulator who finds and tries the exact right key discovers, to their genuine surprise, that it simply doesn't turn anymore. Perrine's actual path toward becoming resistant to this particular pattern involved directly confronting the underlying fear her friend's tactic had been exploiting. This meant real, uncomfortable work, examining honestly whether having needs and boundaries actually made her selfish in any way that held up under scrutiny, or whether this belief was simply an old, inherited distortion from a specific, difficult childhood circumstance that had nothing to do with her actual character as an adult. It meant practicing, deliberately and often uncomfortably, holding a boundary even while someone accused her of selfishness for holding it, allowing the accusation to land, to be genuinely uncomfortable, without automatically treating it as true simply because it was uncomfortable to hear. Over time, something remarkable happened. The exact same accusation, "You're being selfish," that had once reliably collapsed Perrine's resolve, within seconds began to lose its power entirely. Not because her friend stopped using it, she continued, for a while, exactly as before, but the lock it had once fit no longer existed in the same form, and the key, however skillfully applied, simply had nothing left to catch on. Perrine found herself able to hear the accusation, consider it honestly and briefly, and continue holding her boundary anyway, because she had done the deeper work of genuinely, internally resolving whether the accusation was actually true, rather than continuing to carry an old, unexamined fear that made the question feel too dangerous to ever seriously ask. I want to be clear about something important here, because this chapter could be misread as suggesting that victims of manipulation are somehow responsible for having been manipulated. That is not what's being argued, and it would be a genuinely harmful misreading. Manipulators bear full moral responsibility for their manipulative behavior, regardless of what vulnerabilities their target happens to carry. This chapter is not about blame, it's about power, specifically about where your actual power to protect yourself is located. You cannot control whether a manipulator exists in your life, or what tactics they choose to try. You can, with real and sustained effort, control whether the specific locks those tactics depend on remain open or become genuinely resolved. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this first chapter. The people who cannot be manipulated are not people with some innate immunity, or people who've simply never met a sufficiently skilled manipulator. They are people who have done the harder, less visible work of identifying their own specific vulnerabilities, the exact fears, insecurities, and unresolved beliefs that manipulation typically depends on, and addressing them directly, so that even the most precisely aimed tactic finds nothing left to grip. This is genuinely difficult work, and it's the work this entire journey is going to help you undertake, one specific vulnerability at a time. In the next chapter, we're going to look closely at one of the most common and most powerful of these vulnerabilities, the deep, often unconscious need for other people's approval, and why loosening its grip is one of the single most protective things you can ever do for yourself. Chapter 2. The Approval Trap. There is a specific need, so common and so deeply human that almost no one escapes it entirely, that manipulators return to more reliably than almost any other single vulnerability: the need to be seen as good, as likable, as approved of by the people around you. And I want to spend this chapter examining exactly how this ordinary, universal human need becomes, when left unexamined, one of the most exploitable openings a manipulator can find. Let's understand why this particular need is so powerfully exploitable. Well, human beings, as explored in other contexts, are wired at a deep level to care about social approval. For most of human history, being cast out of the group meant real physical danger, and that ancient wiring hasn't updated itself for a modern world where disapproval rarely threatens actual survival. This means nearly everyone carries some baseline sensitivity to being disliked or disapproved of. But there is a meaningful difference between an ordinary, healthy desire for approval, one that coexists comfortably with the capacity to disappoint people when necessary, and a deep, largely unconscious dependency on approval, where the mere possibility of someone's disapproval becomes so unbearable that almost any behavior can be extracted in order to avoid it. Manipulators, whether through conscious calculation or simple, well-practiced instinct, tend to locate this second, deeper version with remarkable accuracy, and once located, it becomes an extraordinarily reliable lever. The tactic is almost always some version of the same basic move: withdrawing warmth, expressing disappointment, implying disapproval whenever the target does something the manipulator doesn't want, and restoring warmth the moment the target complies. Over time, this creates a powerful, almost Pavlovian conditioning. Compliance becomes associated with relief, and any deviation from what the manipulator wants becomes associated with a specific, dreaded emotional withdrawal the target will do almost anything to avoid. Let me tell you about a man named Aurelio. Aurelio worked for years under a manager who never once raised his voice, never issued an explicit threat, never did anything that would show up clearly on any formal complaint. What he did, consistently and skillfully, was something quieter and considerably harder to name. Whenever Aurelio pushed back on an unreasonable request, disagreed with a decision, or simply advocated for himself in any way, the manager's warmth would visibly, noticeably cool, not dramatically, just enough. A slightly shorter greeting the next morning, a slightly longer pause before responding to an email, a subtle but unmistakable chill that would persist for days, until Aurelio, unable to bear the accumulated discomfort, found some way to smooth things over, generally by backing down from whatever he'd originally pushed back on. This pattern repeated, in various forms, for nearly 3 years, and Aurelio, looking back on it honestly, described it as one of the more psychologically exhausting periods of his professional life, not because of any single dramatic incident, but because of the constant, low-grade vigilance required to monitor and manage his manager's approval, a vigilance that left him little energy for anything else, including his actual work. What eventually helped Aurelio recognize and begin dismantling this pattern was a specific, clarifying question offered by a mentor outside his workplace, who had noticed how much of Aurelio's energy seemed consumed by managing this one relationship. What would actually happen, specifically, if he simply tolerated the disapproval instead of rushing to fix it? Aurelio, when he actually sat with this question honestly, realized he had never once tested it. He had spent 3 years assuming, without ever verifying, that the manager's disapproval was genuinely unbearable, something requiring immediate action to resolve, without ever actually finding out what would happen if he simply let it exist, uncorrected, for a while. The experiment, when Aurelio finally tried it, was genuinely uncomfortable, exactly as he expected. The next time he disagreed with an unreasonable request, and the manager's characteristic coolness arrived, Aurelio did something he'd never done before. Nothing. He didn't apologize. He didn't scramble to smooth things over. He simply continued doing his work, competently, and professionally, while allowing the coolness to exist, unaddressed, in the background. What Aurelio discovered, over the following days, surprised him considerably. The world did not end. His job was not threatened. The coolness, uncomfortable as it was to tolerate, eventually simply passed on its own, the same way weather passes, without requiring the elaborate management Aurelio had assumed, for 3 years, was absolutely necessary. And something important shifted in him as a result of this single experiment. The specific lever his manager had been using so effectively, the threat of withdrawn approval, lost a significant portion of its power, because Aurelio now had direct, lived proof that the disapproval, while unpleasant, was genuinely survivable. I want to name something crucial about why this experiment mattered so much, because it points toward the actual mechanism of building resistance to this particular vulnerability. The power of a feared consequence is always, in part, a function of how untested it remains. As long as Aurelio had never actually tolerated his manager's disapproval, his mind was free to imagine it as catastrophic, unbearable, something requiring any cost to avoid. The moment he actually tested it and survived it, the catastrophic imagined version collapsed into something considerably more manageable. Genuinely uncomfortable, yes, but not actually dangerous, not actually requiring the total capitulation he'd been offering for years. This is worth carrying forward as a genuinely practical tool. The specific dependency on approval that makes a person exploitable is rarely dismantled through willpower or simple decision alone. It's dismantled, far more reliably, through direct, repeated experience of surviving the disapproval you've been avoiding. Small experiments, deliberately undertaken, that gradually prove to your own nervous system what your intellect may already suspect. That disapproval, however uncomfortable, is rarely the emergency it feels like in the moment. I want to be careful here, because this is not an argument for becoming indifferent to other people's opinions entirely, or for treating every relationship as a battlefield to be won through stubborn resistance. Genuine care about how the people you love perceive you is a normal, healthy part of intimate relationship, and this chapter is not arguing against that. The specific target here is the deeper, more corrosive version, the dependency so strong that it can be weaponized, deliberately or instinctively, by someone willing to exploit it. Aurelio's eventual relationship, with genuine feedback and disagreement, even from people he respected, remained thoughtful and responsive. What changed was his relationship to manufactured, weaponized disapproval specifically. Disapproval offered not as honest feedback, but as a lever to extract compliance. Here is a practice worth carrying forward from Aurelio's experience, one you can apply directly the next time you notice yourself rushing to appease someone's disapproval, before you've even paused to evaluate whether the underlying request or criticism is actually legitimate. Ask yourself honestly, what would actually happen if I simply tolerated this discomfort instead of immediately acting to resolve it? Then, in a situation where the stakes are genuinely manageable, actually test it. Notice what happens. More often than the anxious, anticipatory mind expects, you'll discover exactly what Aurelio discovered. The disapproval is uncomfortable and survivable, and considerably less powerful once you've proven to yourself, directly, that you can withstand it. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this chapter. The need for approval, left completely unexamined, becomes one of the most reliable levers a manipulator can find, because it makes almost any behavior extractable in exchange for restored warmth. Loosening this dependency, not eliminating your care for others' opinions entirely, but building genuine tolerance for disapproval when it's unreasonable or manufactured, is one of the single most protective, most freeing pieces of psychological work available to you, and it is built, most reliably, through direct experience rather than through simply deciding, intellectually, that you no longer care. In the next chapter, we're going to look at a second, closely related vulnerability manipulators frequently exploit: the tendency to doubt your own perception and memory the moment someone else confidently insists you're wrong, and how to build a foundation of self-trust sturdy enough to withstand that specific pressure. Chapter 13: How Unmanipulable People Actually Love. There is a common, mistaken assumption worth dismantling directly in this chapter: because it colors how many people imagine the entire journey this book has been describing. The assumption that a person who cannot be manipulated must by necessity be somewhat guarded, somewhat withholding, somewhat harder to reach emotionally than someone still vulnerable to manipulation's various pressures. I want to spend this chapter showing you, through careful examination, why the opposite is actually closer to the truth. Why people who have genuinely built the internal foundation this journey has explored tend, in practice, to love more freely, more warmly, and more genuinely than people still operating from the various vulnerabilities this journey has spent so much time examining. Let's understand why this counterintuitive truth actually holds up under honest examination. Every vulnerability explored throughout this journey, the need for approval, the doubt of your own perception, susceptibility to guilt and comparison, difficulty tolerating conflict, vulnerability to manufactured urgency, doesn't just make a person exploitable by manipulators. It also, quietly and consistently, distorts how that person shows up in every relationship, including the genuinely healthy ones. A person anxiously dependent on approval cannot fully relax into being truly known, because some part of them remains perpetually monitoring for signs of disapproval. A person who doubts their own perception cannot fully trust their own experience of being loved, because the same uncertainty that makes them vulnerable to gaslighting also makes it harder for them to trust genuine, honest expressions of care when they receive them. A person who cannot tolerate conflict cannot engage in the honest, sometimes difficult negotiation that genuine intimacy actually requires, because they're too busy managing the discomfort of any disagreement to actually work through it collaboratively. Let me tell you about a man named Wenceslas, whose experience illustrates this transformation clearly. Wenceslas had spent years, prior to doing the kind of internal work this journey has explored, in relationships characterized by a specific, familiar pattern: intense, anxious effort to be liked, followed by quiet resentment when that effort wasn't adequately reciprocated, followed by conflict avoidance that left genuine grievances unaddressed until they eventually erupted, often disproportionately, over some minor triggering incident. His relationships, viewed honestly, were not manipulated exactly, but they were shaped, consistently, by exactly the vulnerabilities this journey has spent so much time examining, producing a pattern of anxious effort, quiet resentment, and periodic eruption that left both Wenceslas and the people who loved him consistently unsatisfied. The internal work Wenceslas undertook, over several years, touched on nearly every specific practice explored throughout this journey: building tolerance for disapproval, learning to distinguish genuine guilt from manufactured guilt, even within his own mind, developing capacity to tolerate necessary conflict rather than avoiding it reflexively, building an internal, independently held sense of his own worth. And the effect this work had on his relationships surprised him considerably, because it ran counter to an assumption he'd carried, without fully examining it, throughout the earlier years of this process, that becoming less vulnerable to these various pressures would make him somehow colder, more guarded, harder to connect with. What actually happened was the opposite. Freed from the anxious need for constant approval, Wenceslas found himself able to be genuinely, fully present with the people he loved, rather than perpetually monitoring their reactions for signs of disapproval that required immediate management. Freed from automatic capitulation in the face of conflict, he found himself able to actually work through disagreements honestly, rather than either avoiding them or exploding after too much accumulated, unaddressed resentment. Freed from a need for external validation of his own worth, he found himself able to offer genuine, unguarded warmth, because that warmth no longer carried the same risk it once had. He no longer needed the people he loved to constantly reassure him of his own adequacy in order to feel secure in offering them his full presence and care. I want to name something important about why this shift produces genuinely deeper intimacy, not less, because it clarifies something crucial about what this entire journey has actually been building toward. Genuine intimacy requires the capacity to be fully seen, including the parts of yourself that aren't perfectly likable, the disagreements that aren't immediately resolved, the honest expression of needs that might not be immediately met. A person operating from the various vulnerabilities this journey has explored often cannot offer this kind of full presence, because too much of their internal energy is consumed by managing the anxious, protective patterns those vulnerabilities produce. A person who has done the deeper work this journey describes has, in a real sense, more of themselves actually available for genuine connection, not because they care less about the relationship, but because they're no longer spending so much of their internal resources on anxious self-protection. There's a specific quality worth naming here, one that Wenceslas's partner described, once his internal work had progressed considerably, as one of the most significant changes she'd noticed in their relationship, a new capacity for what she called settled presence, the ability to simply be with her, fully, without the subtle underlying current of anxious management that had previously colored even their good moments together. This settled presence, she noted, made genuine vulnerability considerably easier for her as well, because Wenceslas's own internal steadiness created a kind of safety that his earlier, more anxious version of himself simply hadn't been able to offer, regardless of how much he'd genuinely loved her throughout. I want to draw out something important about how this connects to the capacity for genuine repair after conflict, because it represents one of the more significant, practical benefits of the internal work this journey has described. Wenceslas's earlier pattern of conflict avoidance, followed by periodic disproportionate eruption, had made genuine repair after disagreement almost impossible. Either issues went unaddressed indefinitely, building quiet resentment, or they exploded in a form too intense and too disproportionate for either partner to productively work through. Once Wenceslas had built genuine tolerance for the discomfort of necessary conflict, something important became possible that hadn't been available before: honest, timely disagreement, addressed while it was still small and manageable, followed by genuine repair, rather than either indefinite avoidance or periodic, disproportionate eruption. I want to be careful here, because this chapter shouldn't be read as suggesting that people still working through the vulnerabilities this journey has explored are somehow incapable of genuine love, or that their relationships lack real value simply because these particular patterns remain unaddressed. Real, meaningful love exists across an enormous range of psychological maturity and self-awareness, and this chapter's point is more specific. The internal work this journey has described tends to deepen and strengthen a person's capacity for intimacy, rather than diminishing it, which directly contradicts the common, understandable assumption that emotional guardedness and resistance to manipulation must go hand in hand. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this chapter. The person who cannot be manipulated is not, contrary to a common and understandable assumption, someone who has become emotionally guarded or difficult to reach. They are, in practice, often someone considerably more capable of full, genuine presence in their relationships, freed from the various anxious, protective patterns that vulnerability to manipulation both depends on and quietly produces in every other area of a person's relational life. The work this journey has described protects you from exploitation, yes, but its deeper, more valuable gift is the freedom it creates for genuine, unguarded connection with the people who actually deserve your full presence and trust. In the next chapter, we're going to look at something important for sustaining everything this journey has built: how this internal foundation actually gets maintained and strengthened over the course of an ordinary life, rather than treated as a single achievement completed once and never revisited again. Chapter 14: Maintaining What You've Built. There is an important, practical question worth addressing directly as this journey nears its close. How does everything explored across these chapters actually get maintained over the course of an ordinary life, rather than treated as a single achievement, completed once and requiring no further attention? I want to spend this chapter offering an honest, practical picture of what ongoing maintenance actually looks like, because a foundation this important deserves genuine, sustained tending, rather than being treated as a project with a clean, final finish line. Here is something worth understanding clearly at the outset. The internal work this journey has described is not a one-time achievement that, once completed, permanently immunizes you against every future manipulation attempt. It's closer to a skill and a foundation that requires ongoing practice and periodic reinforcement, particularly during specific periods of vulnerability, significant life transitions, periods of genuine stress or exhaustion, relationships that test your resolve in ways your previous experience hasn't fully prepared you for. Let me tell you about a woman named Hyacinth, whose experience illustrates what genuine, ongoing maintenance actually looks like in practice, across the real, extended texture of an ordinary life. Hyacinth had done genuine, significant work over several years, building nearly every capacity this journey has explored: internal self-worth, honest discernment between genuine and manufactured guilt, tolerance for necessary conflict, a rich network of outside relationships providing ongoing perspective. And this work had served her well for a considerable period, across several relationships and situations where her previous, less developed self would very likely have been genuinely exploited. But Hyacinth encountered, at a later point in her life, a specific situation that tested this foundation more severely than anything she'd faced during the years she'd actually built it. A period of genuine, significant life stress, a health crisis in her immediate family, combined with real professional pressure that left her considerably more depleted, considerably more emotionally vulnerable than she'd been during the calmer years when her internal foundation had originally been constructed. During this specific, difficult stretch, she found herself, to her own genuine surprise, considerably more susceptible to a colleague's subtle manipulative tactics than she would have predicted, based on her own hard-won progress in earlier years. This experience, disorienting as it initially was, taught Hyacinth something important worth carrying forward directly. The internal foundation this journey has described is genuinely real and genuinely valuable, but it is not entirely immune to depletion during periods of significant stress or exhaustion. Just as physical strength built through years of exercise can still be temporarily compromised by illness or extreme fatigue, psychological resilience, built through years of genuine internal work, can be temporarily strained by periods of significant life stress, leaving a person more vulnerable during those specific periods than their accumulated progress alone would suggest. I want to name something important about how Hyacinth actually navigated this discovery, because it offers a genuinely useful practice worth carrying forward. Rather than treating this temporary vulnerability as evidence that her years of work had somehow failed or been undone, she came to understand it as valuable information about a specific, practical need. During periods of significant stress or depletion, additional vigilance and additional support become genuinely necessary, precisely because the internal foundation, while real, operates with somewhat reduced capacity during these specific windows. This points toward a practical, ongoing maintenance practice worth carrying forward directly, periodically, honestly assessing your own current capacity, particularly during significant life transitions or periods of genuine stress, and adjusting your vigilance and support accordingly. This might mean, during a particularly difficult stretch, deliberately increasing contact with the trusted outside relationships explored in an earlier chapter, rather than assuming your accumulated internal strength alone will be sufficient regardless of current circumstances. It might mean approaching significant decisions with even more caution and more deliberate delay than usual, recognizing that depleted judgment, even judgment built on genuinely solid foundations, benefits from additional structural protection during specifically vulnerable periods. I want to name something important about a related, ongoing practice worth building: periodic, honest reflection on your own patterns, even after significant progress has been made. Hyacinth found it valuable, once or twice a year, to sit down and honestly review her recent relationships and interactions, asking herself directly whether any of the specific patterns explored throughout this journey, manufactured guilt, weaponized comparison, gradual isolation, intermittent reinforcement, had begun reappearing in any form, even subtle, even in relationships that had previously seemed entirely healthy. This periodic review isn't about generating the kind of chronic, indiscriminate suspicion explored in an earlier chapter. It's about maintaining genuine, ongoing awareness, rather than assuming that progress made in earlier years provides permanent, complete protection, requiring no further attention. There's a related insight worth naming here, one that connects to something explored in an earlier journey, about the nature of psychological growth generally. This work, like most genuine psychological development, tends to happen not as a single, permanent achievement, but as an ongoing, lifelong practice, deepening over time, generally becoming easier and more automatic with continued practice, but never quite reaching a point where it requires no further attention at all. This isn't a discouraging thing to understand. It simply reflects the genuine, honest nature of what's actually being built here, considerably more valuable and considerably more durable than a quick technique, precisely because it operates as an ongoing relationship with yourself, rather than a problem solved once and permanently closed. I want to offer something practical about how to actually sustain this ongoing practice without it becoming exhausting or overly effortful in its own right, because that would work against the deeper goal this journey has been building toward throughout. The maintenance being described here doesn't require constant, active vigilance in every single interaction. It requires, more precisely, periodic check-ins, honest, occasional reflection during calm moments, combined with a general, background awareness that becomes, with enough sustained practice, considerably less effortful over time, much the way any skill, thoroughly practiced, eventually requires less conscious effort to sustain than it did during its initial construction. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this chapter. The internal foundation this journey has described is genuinely real, genuinely valuable, and genuinely durable, but it benefits from ongoing periodic maintenance, rather than being treated as a single, permanently completed achievement. Build the practice of honest, periodic self-reflection. Adjust your vigilance and support during periods of genuine stress or depletion, and trust that this ongoing maintenance, sustained gently over time, becomes considerably less effortful than the initial work of building the foundation itself. In the final chapter of this journey, we're going to bring everything together and close with a reflection on what it actually means to move through the world as someone who has built this kind of genuine, sturdy freedom. Chapter 15. The quiet freedom of being unshakable. We began this journey with a question worth returning to now, at its close. Why do some people walk out of a room, having encountered exactly the kind of pressure that would have turned someone else completely around, and remain simply, quietly unmoved? I hope, after everything we've walked through together, that question no longer feels like a mystery. It was never about some innate immunity, some special resistance handed to a fortunate few at birth. It was always about a specific, learnable architecture of mind. One this entire journey has spent 15 chapters helping you understand, piece by careful piece. You know now that manipulation cannot work alone. It requires a matching vulnerability in its target, and you've walked through the most common of these vulnerabilities directly: the need for approval, the doubt of your own perception under confident pressure, the confusion of manufactured guilt with genuine guilt, the dread of conflict strong enough to override your own judgment, the pull of manufactured urgency, the powerful, disorienting grip of intermittent reinforcement, the sting of weaponized comparison, and the quiet, gradual danger of isolation from outside perspective. You've considered the deeper foundation beneath all of these specific vulnerabilities, a genuine, internally referenced sense of your own worth, built patiently rather than granted instantly, sturdy enough that the various levers manipulation depends on simply find less and less to grip onto. You've prepared, honestly, for what happens when manipulation escalates rather than simply fading, understanding that escalation, however frightening in the moment, is often evidence that your resistance is working rather than evidence that it's failing. You've considered the important corrective of discernment over indiscriminate suspicion, protecting yourself from becoming so thoroughly guarded that you lose access to the genuine trust and intimacy that make a protected life actually worth living. You've seen through Wenceslas's story that this entire journey leads not toward emotional guardedness but toward a considerably deeper capacity for genuine, unguarded love. And you've considered, honestly, what it actually takes to maintain this foundation over the real, extended texture of an ordinary life, rather than treating it as a single achievement completed once and never revisited again. I want to say something directly to you now, in this final, quiet chapter, because I think it matters more than any single tactic or technique this journey has offered. Everything we've explored together was never really about becoming harder, colder, more suspicious of the world. It was about becoming, in the fullest and most genuine sense, more yourself, rooted enough in your own honest values, your own genuine perception, your own considered sense of your own worth, that the various pressures other people might bring to bear on you simply have less and less to work with, the more solid that rootedness becomes. I want to leave you with something simple, because simple is what will actually serve you as you carry this journey forward into the ordinary texture of your own life. You do not need to master every idea explored here immediately, and you do not need to become instantly, permanently immune to every manipulation tactic that might ever be tried against you. That was never really the invitation. The invitation simply is this: the next time you notice yourself rushing to comply, rushing to explain, rushing to prove yourself, rushing to decide, pause just for a moment and ask, gently, without harsh self-judgment, is this genuinely my own considered choice, or is this fear, doubt, guilt, or pressure making this decision for me? That single pause, practiced consistently over time, is the entire foundation everything else in this journey has been built upon. Consider, for a moment, the life available to you on the other side of this kind of genuine, sturdy rootedness. Not a life free of disagreement, or difficulty, or people who will, from time to time, want something from you that isn't genuinely in your own best interest. Every life, however protected, includes these ordinary difficulties, but a life met differently, with a settled internal knowledge of your own worth that doesn't require anyone else's constant validation in order to feel complete, with genuine discernment that can recognize real manipulation while remaining fully open to real love, with a foundation sturdy enough that pressure, when it arrives, simply passes through you rather than reshaping you into whatever someone else needed you to become. This is not a small thing to have built, or to still be building. It is, I think, one of the more valuable gifts a person can offer themselves, not because it makes life easier in every moment, but because it makes you, finally and genuinely, the author of your own choices, rather than a character quietly written by whoever happens to be applying the most pressure in any given moment. So let this be where we rest, not with more to master, not with constant vigilance required from here forward, just with a quiet, settled recognition of what you've already begun building, chapter by chapter, choice by choice, throughout this entire journey. The people who cannot be manipulated were never born that way. They built it, patiently, the same way you're building it now, one honest pause, one tolerated discomfort, one genuine choice at a time. Go forward rooted, and go forward with the quiet, hard-won knowledge that your own perception, your own values, and your own worth belong to you completely, and that no pressure, however skillfully applied, can take from you what you have finally, genuinely, learned to hold on to yourself. Chapter 16. There is a specific gap in everything we've explored so far, and I want to address it directly, because leaving it unaddressed would leave you protected against one category of pressure, while remaining fully exposed to another, arguably larger one. Everything this journey has covered has assumed a manipulator is a specific person, someone you can identify, name, and apply these principles against directly. But a considerable amount of the manipulation shaping modern life doesn't come from any single person at all. It comes from systems, advertising, algorithmic feeds, workplace cultures, social norms engineered by people you'll never meet, designed with exactly the same psychological levers explored throughout this journey, deployed at a scale no individual manipulator could ever achieve on their own. I want to be precise about why this distinction matters, because the mechanisms are often identical even when the source is entirely different. A social media platform's recommendation algorithm doesn't consciously target your specific insecurity about approval the way a manipulative partner might, but it doesn't need to act consciously in order to function that way. It simply needs to notice, through the accumulated data of millions of users, that content triggering approval anxiety, comparison, urgency, and intermittent reward keeps people scrolling longer than content that doesn't. And once it notices this, it optimizes toward exactly those levers, relentlessly and at a scale no human manipulator could match, without any single person ever making a deliberate decision to exploit you personally. The system doesn't need intent. It only needs a feedback loop that rewards whatever keeps you engaged. And the same vulnerabilities this journey has spent 15 chapters helping you recognize turn out to be extraordinarily effective at keeping anyone engaged, regardless of whether a human being is deliberately aiming at them. Let me tell you about a man named Bertrand, whose experience illustrates how directly these same patterns transfer from interpersonal manipulation to systemic manipulation. Bertrand had done real, genuine work over several years, building resistance to interpersonal manipulation of almost every kind explored throughout this journey. He'd left a manipulative relationship, rebuilt his sense of internal worth, developed genuine discernment about guilt, comparison, and urgency in his personal life. He considered himself, with real justification, someone who had become genuinely difficult to manipulate. And yet Bertrand found himself, during a particularly difficult professional stretch, spending upward of 4 hours a day on a specific social media platform, in a pattern he recognized with real discomfort, as almost identical to the intermittent reinforcement explored in an earlier chapter, an unpredictable stream of content, some of it genuinely engaging, most of it unremarkable, that kept him checking, scrolling, refreshing, in a pattern that produced very little actual satisfaction, but proved remarkably difficult to simply walk away from. He noticed, too, a persistent, low-grade comparison anxiety triggered by the platform's content, a steady diet of other people's curated highlights, quietly, cumulatively producing exactly the kind of externally referenced inadequacy explored in the chapter on weaponized comparison, despite Bertrand having done real, genuine work building an internally referenced sense of his own worth in every other domain of his life. This is worth naming directly, because it reveals something important about the specific challenge systemic manipulation poses. Distinct from interpersonal manipulation, you cannot simply confront a system the way you might eventually confront a manipulative individual, and you cannot rely on the system eventually running out of energy or escalating in a way that becomes visible to outside observers, the way interpersonal manipulation sometimes does. A system doesn't get tired. It doesn't escalate and then, eventually, fade when its tactics stop working on you specifically. It simply continues, indefinitely, refined and optimized against the aggregate behavior of millions of other people, entirely indifferent to whether any single individual, including you, has built resistance to it. What helped Bertrand address this specific challenge required adapting the principles from this journey rather than abandoning them, because the underlying psychology remained genuinely the same, even though the source had changed. The fixed rule approach explored in the chapter on manufactured urgency proved directly transferable, rather than trying to exercise moment-to-moment willpower against a system specifically engineered to overwhelm exactly that kind of in-the-moment resistance. Bertrand built structural rules, decided in advance during a calm moment, that didn't require ongoing willpower to sustain, specific time limits enforced through his device's own settings, specific hours during which the platform simply wasn't accessible at all, a deliberate removal of the app from the device he carried with him constantly, replaced by access only through a considerably less convenient route that reintroduced exactly the kind of friction his own impulsive engagement had been designed to bypass. I want to name something important about why structural solutions work better than willpower-based solutions when facing systemic rather than interpersonal manipulation, because it's a genuinely useful distinction worth carrying forward. An interpersonal manipulator, however skilled, has limited attention and limited persistence. They cannot optimize their approach against you personally, with anything like the resources a well-funded platform can bring to bear on its recommendation systems. This means that against a system relying primarily on your own moment-to-moment discernment, however well-developed, puts you at a genuine, structural disadvantage. You're bringing a single, however well-trained mind to a contest against systems built by large teams, tested against millions of users, and specifically refined, continuously, to overcome exactly the kind of resistance an individual mind can bring to bear. The solution, correspondingly, needs to be structural too. Barriers, limits, and defaults set during moments of clarity, designed specifically to not require ongoing willpower to sustain, precisely because ongoing willpower is the resource these systems are specifically engineered to outlast. There's a second, related category of systemic manipulation worth naming directly, because it operates through a slightly different mechanism than algorithmic engagement optimization: the manufactured urgency and manufactured scarcity that pervade modern consumer culture. Limited time offers, countdown timers, messages informing you that other people are currently viewing the same item, notifications suggesting stock is running low. These are, almost without exception, deliberately engineered applications of exactly the manufactured urgency explored in an earlier chapter, deployed not by any individual manipulator with a personal stake in your specific decision, but by systems designed, tested, and refined specifically because urgency reliably increases purchasing behavior across large populations, regardless of whether the urgency reflects any genuine scarcity at all. The fixed rule protection explored in that earlier chapter transfers directly here as well. A general policy, decided in advance, that significant purchases require a mandatory waiting period, regardless of how the specific offer is framed, protects you against this systemic version of manufactured urgency exactly as effectively as it protects you against an individual manipulator's manufactured urgency, because the underlying psychological mechanism being exploited is identical, even though no individual human being is deliberately targeting you personally. I want to address something important about weaponized comparison as it appears systemically, because it operates with a scale and pervasiveness that interpersonal comparison, however painful, rarely matches. Where a single manipulative person might invoke comparison to a specific, named individual, algorithmic content feeds expose users to a nearly unlimited, constantly refreshing stream of curated comparison, other people's achievements, appearances, relationships, and lifestyles, selected and amplified specifically because content-triggering comparison-based engagement tends to perform well by the system's own metrics, regardless of the genuine psychological cost this comparison exacts on the peoples of the internal work explored in the chapter on weaponized comparison, building an internally referenced standard for your own worth, rather than one that shifts based on whatever comparison happens to be presented, proves, if anything, more essential here than in the interpersonal context, precisely because the sheer volume and constancy of systemic comparison vastly exceeds what any interpersonal relationship could produce. Bertrand found that his previously built internal standards, robust enough to withstand occasional interpersonal comparison, required real, additional reinforcement to withstand the sheer volume of comparison a few hours of algorithmic content could produce. A useful reminder that psychological resistance, like physical conditioning, needs to be calibrated to the actual intensity of what it's being asked to withstand. I want to offer something important about isolation as it appears in systemic form, because it inverts the pattern explored in the earlier chapter in a genuinely interesting way. Where interpersonal manipulation typically isolates by narrowing a person's outside relationships, algorithmic systems often produce a different, more paradoxical kind of isolation. Hours spent in a state that feels like connection, scrolling through other people's lives, and engaging with content designed to feel social, while actual, textured, reciprocal relationship time steadily decreases. Bertrand noticed, honestly examining his own pattern, that his genuine, in-person connection with friends and family had measurably declined during the same period his platform usage had increased, not because anyone had deliberately isolated him, but because the system's design had made a shallow substitute for connection considerably more immediately accessible than the real thing, gradually crowding out exactly the kind of rich, reciprocal relationship that protects against manipulation in every form this journey has explored. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this chapter. The same psychological vulnerabilities explored throughout this journey are exploited not only by individual manipulators, but by systems, algorithmic, commercial, cultural, operating at a scale and with a persistence no individual could match. Recognizing this distinction matters because the solutions need to be structural rather than purely willpower-based, fixed rules decided in advance, deliberate friction reintroduced into systems designed to eliminate it, and genuine, deliberate protection of the real, reciprocal relationships that shallow, algorithmically optimized substitutes are specifically engineered to displace. The person who cannot be manipulated, in the fullest sense this journey has been building toward, must eventually extend this same discernment beyond individual relationships toward the considerably larger, more pervasive systems quietly shaping daily life in exactly the same directions this entire journey has taught you to recognize and resist. Chapter 17. There is a final dimension of this work worth exploring directly, one that extends beyond your own personal protection into something with considerably longer reach, what it actually looks like to help the people you love, children, younger relatives, friends still caught in patterns you've since moved beyond, build this same kind of internal resistance. Without simply lecturing them about manipulation in the abstract, or worse, producing exactly the kind of chronic, indiscriminate suspicion explored in an earlier chapter as an unintended cost of trying to protect them too aggressively. I want to begin by naming something important about why this matters so much, beyond simple generosity. Every specific vulnerability explored throughout this journey, the need for approval, the doubt of one's own perception, susceptibility to manufactured guilt, difficulty tolerating conflict, has roots that typically extend back into childhood, shaped by the specific relational environment a person grew up inside. This means that the most powerful, most durable form of protection against manipulation isn't something built primarily in adulthood, in response to already experienced harm, the way most of the stories throughout this journey have described. It's something that can, with real intention, be built considerably earlier, in childhood, by parents and caregivers who understand, clearly, exactly which patterns tend to produce vulnerability and which tend to produce resilience. Let me tell you about a woman named Friedzweide, whose experience illustrates what this looks like in practice. Friedzweide had done real, extensive work, over years, addressing her own vulnerability to nearly every pattern explored throughout this journey. She had grown up in a household characterized by exactly the kind of manufactured guilt and conditional approval explored in earlier chapters, and her adult life had included several relationships that exploited these inherited vulnerabilities before she finally recognized and addressed them directly. When she became a parent herself, she carried a specific, deliberate intention to raise a child considerably less vulnerable to these same patterns than she herself had been, without simply transmitting anxious suspicion in place of the anxious compliance she'd been raised with. The actual work of doing this, Friedzweide found, required translating nearly every principle explored throughout this journey into something considerably more concrete and considerably more age-appropriate than the adult framework this journey has used. The chapter on approval, for instance, translated into a specific, deliberate parenting practice, rather than making her affection and warmth contingent on her child's compliance or achievement, the pattern that had produced her own adult vulnerability to approval-based manipulation. She worked to maintain consistent warmth, regardless of her child's specific behavior in any given moment, reserving actual consequences for genuine behavioral issues, while keeping her fundamental affection and acceptance entirely separate from those consequences. This distinction, subtle but genuinely important, aims to prevent exactly the association between approval and compliance that makes approval such an effective manipulative lever in adulthood. The chapter on trusting one's own perception translated into a specific, deliberate practice worth naming directly. When Friedzweide's child expressed a feeling or a memory of an event, she made a genuine, consistent effort to validate the child's actual experience. "It sounds like that really upset you," rather than immediately correcting or dismissing it, even in situations where an adult perspective might genuinely see the situation somewhat differently. This isn't about teaching a child that their perception is always factually complete or accurate in every detail. It's about protecting something more foundational, the basic, early trust in one's own inner experience, that gaslighting, in adulthood, specifically depends on eroding. A child whose early emotional experience was consistently validated, even when adults gently offered additional context or correction, tends to carry into adulthood a considerably sturdier baseline trust in their own perception. than a child whose emotional experience was routinely dismissed, minimized, or overridden by more confident adult assertion. The chapter on manufactured guilt translated into something Friedzweig found genuinely difficult to maintain, consistently, worth naming honestly, resisting the common parenting reflex of inducing guilt as a behavioral shortcut. "You're really hurting me by acting this way," or "after everything I do for you," phrases that produce quick behavioral compliance in the moment, but that, deployed repeatedly over years, teach a child exactly the pattern explored in the chapter on manufactured guilt, that their caregiver's disappointment, rather than an honest examination of their own actual conduct, is the primary signal that should govern their behavior. Friedzweig worked, with real effort and real imperfection, to address behavioral issues through direct, specific conversation about actual consequences and actual expectations, rather than through the emotionally weighted guilt induction that had characterized much of her own childhood. I want to name something important about the chapter on conflict tolerance, because it translates into parenting in a way worth understanding directly. Friedzweig made a deliberate effort not to teach her child that disagreement itself was dangerous or something to be avoided at any cost, a lesson many children absorb, often unintentionally, from households where parental conflict, when it occurs, is genuinely frightening, or where any expression of the child's own disagreement is met with disproportionate discomfort or punishment. Instead, she worked to model and to permit honest disagreement handled respectfully, allowing her child to voice genuine objections and negotiate reasonable requests, rather than requiring immediate, anxious compliance in every interaction, precisely because a child who learns early that disagreement is survivable and that their own voice matters in a negotiation tends to carry into adulthood considerably more resistance to the conflict avoidance vulnerability explored in an earlier chapter. I want to offer something honest about the limits of this kind of intentional parenting, because Friedzweig herself was careful not to present it as a guaranteed formula. Children are not blank templates onto which a parent's careful intentions are simply, reliably imprinted. Genuine temperament, outside relationships and influences, and simple, ordinary human imperfection on the part of even the most intentional parent all shape a child's eventual resilience in ways no single approach can fully control or guarantee. Friedzweig's own child, she was honest in acknowledging, still carried some vulnerabilities, some patterns not fully addressed by even her most careful, deliberate efforts, because raising a child, like every other domain this journey has explored, involves genuine complexity that no framework, however thoughtfully applied, can completely master. I want to address something important about passing this work on to adults already in your life, friends, siblings, partners, who remain caught in patterns you yourself have since moved beyond, because the approach here needs to be considerably different from the parenting context, and getting this difference wrong can cause real, if unintended, harm. Friedzweig described a specific, difficult period where she attempted, with real good intention, to help a close friend recognize a manipulative pattern in the friend's own relationship, directly naming the specific tactics, drawing explicit parallels to concepts she'd learned through her own recovery, essentially delivering, unprompted, a compressed version of much of this journey's content. This approach, however well-intentioned, largely failed, and it's worth understanding exactly why, because the failure reveals something important about how this kind of insight actually gets absorbed. Friedzweig's friend, confronted directly with an unsolicited analysis of her relationship's manipulative patterns, responded not with gratitude or immediate recognition, but with defensiveness. Precisely the kind of defensiveness that tends to arise when someone's current understanding of their own life is challenged too directly, too quickly, before they've had the chance to arrive at that recognition through their own gradual process. Friedzweig's genuine care and genuine insight, delivered too directly, produced exactly the opposite of its intended effect, straining the friendship rather than helping her friend see the pattern more clearly. What Friedzweig learned through this difficult experience and through subsequent, more successful attempts to support other people she cared about was a considerably more patient, more indirect approach, one worth carrying forward as a final, practical insight from this entire journey. Rather than directly naming a friend's specific situation as manipulative, She found it considerably more effective to simply remain present, warm, and available, offering gentle, honest reflection only when specifically asked, and modeling, through her own visible lived example, what genuine internal security and healthy boundary setting actually looked like in practice. This modeling, sustained patiently over time, often did more to help a struggling friend eventually recognize their own situation than any amount of direct, unsolicited analysis ever could. Because genuine recognition, as this entire journey has explored in other contexts, tends to arrive through a person's own gradual, internal process, rather than through someone else's insistence, however accurate that insistence might actually be. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this final chapter, and from this entire journey as a whole. The deepest, most durable protection against manipulation is not something built only in reaction to harm already experienced. It can be cultivated, deliberately and with real care, in the children in your life, through consistent warmth untethered from compliance, genuine validation of their inner experience, honest handling of guilt and conflict, and a home environment where disagreement is survivable rather than something to be anxiously avoided. And for the adults already in your life still caught in patterns you've since moved beyond, the most effective gift you can offer is rarely direct confrontation with their situation, however accurate your insight might be. It's patient presence, genuine warmth, and the quiet, visible example of what a life built on genuine internal security actually looks like. Trusting, as this entire journey has asked you to trust throughout, that real, lasting change tends to arrive not through someone else's insistence, but through a person's own, gradual, hard-won recognition, offered the same patience and respect you would want extended to yourself. Chapter 18. When the manipulator is a group. There is one more category of manipulation worth examining directly, because it operates through mechanisms distinct from both the interpersonal patterns explored earlier and the systemic, algorithmic patterns explored in the previous chapter. Manipulation exercised not by a single person or an impersonal system, but by a group, a community, an organization, a movement that uses collective belonging itself as the primary lever of control. I want to explain why this category deserves its own careful examination, because group manipulation exploits something even more fundamental than the individual vulnerabilities explored throughout this journey. Every specific tactic we've discussed, manufactured guilt, weaponized comparison, manufactured urgency, becomes considerably more powerful when deployed not by one person, but by an entire community, all reinforcing the same message simultaneously. A single manipulative partner insisting you're wrong can be resisted, eventually, through the outside perspective of friends and family, as explored in an earlier chapter. But what happens when the outside perspective has itself been absorbed into the group doing the manipulating? When every person whose opinion you'd normally check your reality against is telling you the same thing? Let me tell you about a man named Casimir, whose experience illustrates this dynamic with real clarity. Casimir joined, in his late 20s, a tightly organized community that presented itself, initially, as offering exactly what he was genuinely searching for during a difficult period of his life: belonging, purpose, and a clear framework for understanding a world that had, until then, felt confusing and directionless. The early months of his involvement were, by his own honest account, genuinely positive: real friendship, real structure, a real sense of finally belonging somewhere that mattered. The gradual shift, when Casimir eventually recognized it, followed a pattern worth understanding in detail, because it recombines nearly every individual tactic explored throughout this journey into something considerably more comprehensive and considerably harder to resist from within. The group began, subtly at first, discouraging outside relationships, not through explicit prohibition, but through the same kind of gradual, individually reasonable-sounding narrowing explored in the chapter on isolation, framed as outside people simply not understanding or supporting Casimir's new sense of purpose the way the group did. Disagreement with group leadership or group doctrine was met with a specific, effective combination of manufactured guilt, framed as a failure of commitment or gratitude, and weaponized comparison to other members who demonstrated the correct level of devotion. Major decisions, when they arose, were pressed for quick resolution, framed with exactly the manufactured urgency explored in an earlier chapter, discouraging the kind of deliberate, separated decision-making that might have allowed genuine reconsideration. What made this pattern especially difficult to resist, considerably more difficult than any single interpersonal manipulator Casimir might have encountered, was the specific mechanism of collective reinforcement. When Casimir experienced a moment of doubt, a specific policy or demand that struck him, in the moment, as genuinely unreasonable, he had, within the group's structure, no genuinely outside perspective left to check that doubt against. Every person he might normally have turned to for a reality check had either been gradually excluded from his life or was themselves a member of the same group, reinforcing the same framework that made his doubt itself feel like evidence of his own insufficient commitment rather than a genuinely reasonable response to a genuinely unreasonable demand. This is worth naming as one of the most psychologically powerful mechanisms explored across this entire journey, the manufacture of consensus. Human beings, as explored in earlier chapters, are wired to weigh social agreement heavily when evaluating what's true and reasonable. A single confident voice disputing your perception is powerful enough, as explored in the chapter on gaslighting, but an entire community, unanimous and consistent, disputing your perception or reinforcing a specific framework, exercises a psychological pull that individual manipulation simply cannot match. Casimir's doubts, entirely reasonable when he eventually examined them from genuine distance, had felt, from inside the group's manufactured consensus, like evidence of his own personal failing rather than legitimate signal, because every available reference point had been, gradually and systematically, absorbed into the same reinforcing structure. Casimir's eventual path out of this group required something considerably more difficult than the individual resistance explored in earlier chapters of this journey, and I want to be honest about that difficulty rather than minimizing it. It began, in his case, through an accidental, brief reconnection with a family member who had remained entirely outside the group's influence. A single, unexpected conversation that, much like Baltilda's experience in the chapter on isolation, offered a genuinely outside perspective, unfiltered by the group's manufactured consensus. This single outside data point didn't immediately dissolve years of accumulated influence, but it did something crucial. It reintroduced, for the first time in years, the genuine possibility that his own doubts might reflect something real rather than a personal failing. I want to name several specific markers worth carrying forward, useful for recognizing this particular pattern in your own life or in the life of someone you care about. A group that actively, even gradually, discourages meaningful outside relationships deserves real scrutiny, regardless of how positively that discouragement is framed. A group where disagreement or doubt is consistently met with guilt, shaming, or implications of insufficient commitment, rather than genuine, open engagement with the substance of the concern, deserves real scrutiny. A group that consistently presses for quick decisions, discourages independent research, or frames outside information sources as untrustworthy, specifically because they exist outside the group, deserves real scrutiny. None of these markers, individually, proves manipulation with certainty. Genuine, healthy communities and organizations sometimes exhibit isolated versions of these patterns without being fundamentally manipulative, but the accumulated presence of several of these markers together, sustained over time, describes a pattern worth taking seriously. I want to offer something important about how to actually help someone caught in this kind of group dynamic, because it extends directly from the insight explored in the previous chapter about supporting struggling friends. Direct, forceful confrontation, insisting, immediately and explicitly, that someone's community is manipulative, tends to fail for exactly the same reason it failed in Friedzweig's attempt to help her friend, only considerably more severely, because a group-embedded person has typically been prepared, by the group itself, with ready responses to exactly this kind of outside challenge, often framed in advance as evidence of outside people's failure to understand, rather than genuine worthwhile concern. What tends to work considerably better, though it requires real patience, is maintaining consistent, warm, undemanding contact, refusing to disappear from the person's life the way the group's dynamics often encourage, while resisting the urge to force confrontation before the person has begun generating their own doubts. Casimir's family member, in the conversation that eventually helped him, never directly criticized the group at all. She simply remained present, warm, and genuinely interested in Casimir's life, creating exactly the kind of outside reference point that eventually allowed his own doubts room to surface and be taken seriously. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this chapter. Group manipulation combines nearly every individual tactic explored throughout this journey into something considerably more powerful through the specific mechanism of manufactured consensus, removing, gradually, every outside reference point a person might use to check their own doubts against something other than the group's own reinforcing framework. Protecting yourself against this pattern requires the same fundamental practice explored in the chapter on isolation, applied with even greater deliberateness, actively, consistently maintaining relationships and sources of perspective entirely outside any single community or group, regardless of how positive that community currently feels, because the moment a group becomes your only source of reality checking is precisely the moment its potential for this kind of manipulation becomes most dangerous. Chapter 19. The manipulator you cannot simply walk away from. There is a final, uncomfortable dimension of this entire subject worth confronting directly before we close, because everything explored across the preceding 18 chapters has focused on manipulation coming from outside you, other people, systems, groups. But there remains one more source worth examining honestly, arguably the hardest of all to resist, because it never announces itself as coming from outside at all, the manipulation you practice on yourself. I want to name this directly because it's easy, after 18 chapters spent building resistance to external manipulation, to imagine that the work is now essentially complete, that a person who has built genuine discernment against every tactic explored so far has achieved something like full protection. But self-manipulation operates by a different, considerably more elusive mechanism, precisely because there is no outside voice to eventually recognize and resist. The manipulator and the target are, in this specific case, the same person, which means every tool explored throughout this journey, outside perspective, contemporaneous record keeping, trusted relationships offering reality checks, requires real adaptation before it can address this particular, more internal challenge. Let me tell you about a woman named Osyth, whose experience illustrates this pattern with genuine clarity. Osyth had done real, substantial work, over years, building resistance to nearly every external manipulation tactic explored throughout this journey. She had left a manipulative relationship, built genuine internal self-worth, developed real discernment about guilt and comparison and urgency in her interactions with others, and yet she found herself, in a specific and painful area of her own life, engaging in a pattern that, examined honestly, mirrored nearly every tactic this journey has spent so much effort helping her recognize when deployed by someone else, except this time, she was deploying it against herself. Specifically, Osyth had developed over years a pattern of self-talk around her own ambitions and decisions that included manufactured guilt. You should have accomplished more by now. You're being selfish for wanting this. Manufactured urgency. You need to decide right now. There's no time to think this through carefully. And weaponized comparison. Look how much further along everyone else your age has gotten. This internal voice, sustained over years, produced exactly the same anxious compliance and exhausted self-doubt that an external manipulator's tactics would have produced, except there was no outside person to eventually recognize, resist, or walk away from. The manipulation was, in a genuine sense, coming from inside her own mind, using her own voice, which made it considerably harder to identify as manipulation at all, rather than simply accepting it as her own honest, if harsh, self-assessment. This is worth understanding as one of the more genuinely difficult insights available in this entire journey, because it requires applying every principle explored so far to a target, your own internal voice, that doesn't feel like a separate entity the way an external manipulator does. Osyth's actual recognition of this pattern required a specific, deliberate practice worth naming directly, she began, following a suggestion from a therapist, treating her own harsh internal commentary as though it were coming from an external voice, asking the exact same questions this journey has taught you to ask of an external manipulator. Is this guilt actually justified by my own genuine values, examined honestly? Or is it simply harsh, unexamined pressure that happens to be using my own internal voice? Is this urgency genuine, or is it, like manufactured external urgency, designed to prevent the careful consideration a real decision deserves? Is this comparison specific and useful, or vague, unverifiable, and aimed primarily at producing anxious inadequacy rather than genuine, actionable insight? I want to name something important about why this reframe proved so useful for Osyth, because it points toward a genuinely practical tool worth carrying forward. As long as her harsh internal voice felt simply like her own honest, accurate self-assessment, she had no meaningful basis for questioning it. It felt, by definition, like the truth about herself, rather than a pattern that could be examined and potentially challenged. Once she began treating it as a voice, separate and examinable, using the exact same discernment this journey has built for evaluating any other source of pressure or guilt, she gained genuine distance, enough distance to actually apply the tools explored throughout this journey to her own internal experience, rather than simply accepting her harshest self-talk as an unquestionable, accurate verdict. There's a specific, practical tool worth carrying forward from Osyth's experience, directly adapted from the contemporaneous record-keeping explored in the chapter on trusting your own perception. Osyth began keeping a written record, not of external events this time, but of her own internal self-talk, during moments of significant decision or self-assessment, writing down, honestly, exactly what her internal voice was telling her, close to the moment it arose, before she'd had the chance to simply absorb it as unquestionable truth. Reviewing this record over time revealed something important, mirroring exactly what Fitzgerald's journal had revealed about his partner's disputes in an earlier chapter, a consistent, identifiable pattern, considerably harsher and considerably less accurate than Osyth's own more considered, distant judgment would ever produce, revealing her harshest internal voice as a pattern worth questioning rather than a simple, accurate reflection of reality. I want to be honest about where this particular pattern typically originates, because understanding its source matters for actually addressing it, rather than simply managing its symptoms. The harsh, manipulative internal voice Osyth eventually recognized had a clear, traceable history. It echoed, with remarkable precision, the voice of a parent whose own approval had always felt conditional and precarious, exactly the dynamic explored in the very first chapters of this journey. Osyth had, without ever consciously choosing to, internalized that external voice so thoroughly that it had become indistinguishable, for years, from her own genuine judgment. Precisely the mechanism explored in an earlier journey about the inner critic, now understood through the specific lens of manipulation, rather than simply harsh self-criticism. This connection matters enormously because it reveals something important about the relationship between external and internal manipulation. They are not, in fact, entirely separate categories. A person who spent years absorbing external manipulation, particularly during childhood when the capacity to distinguish a caregiver's manipulative pattern from objective reality is genuinely limited, often carries that external voice forward into adulthood as an internalized, self-directed version of the exact same tactics, meaning the work of resisting self-manipulation and the work of resisting external manipulation are, in an important sense, the same work, applied to different targets across different periods of a single, continuous life. I want to offer something important about how Osyth actually addressed this pattern, once she'd recognized it clearly, because it required a specific, deliberate practice worth carrying forward as one of the final tools this journey has to offer. Whenever she noticed her harsh internal voice delivering exactly the kind of manufactured guilt, urgency, or comparison explored throughout this journey, she began, deliberately, responding to it the way she would respond to an external manipulator, using the same tactic, not with harsh internal battle, which simply produces more of the same corrosive internal conflict, but with the same calm, considered examination explored throughout this journey. I notice this thought is using manufactured urgency. I don't need to decide today. I notice this thought is comparing me to an unverifiable standard. Let me check this against my own genuine, considered values instead. I want to close this chapter and this considerably extended journey with something important about what it actually means to have built genuine resistance to manipulation in its fullest sense: external, systemic, group-based, and internal. The person who cannot be manipulated, in the complete sense this journey has explored across 19 chapters, is not simply someone who has learned to distrust other people's pressure. They are someone who has learned, patiently and with real difficulty, to distinguish their own honest, considered judgment from every source of distortion that might otherwise masquerade as truth, whether that distortion arrives from a manipulative partner, an algorithmic feed, a demanding community, or their own internalized, harshest voice. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this final chapter. The deepest work explored throughout this entire journey does not end at the boundary of your own skin. The same discernment that protects you from external manipulation is available and genuinely necessary for examining your own internal voice as well, because a harsh, unexamined internal narrative can produce exactly the same anxious compliance and exhausted self-doubt that any external manipulator's tactics ever could, simply using your own voice to do it. Build the same distance, the same honest examination, the same calm, considered discernment for your own internal commentary that you've built for every external pressure explored throughout this journey, and trust that this final, most internal layer of the work is, in the end, where genuine, complete freedom actually resides.